I was assigned to the night rotation at the facility because nothing ever happened there. That was the phrase they used. Nothing ever happens. No incidents, no alarms, no emergencies, just hours of silence, fluorescent lights, and procedures written decades ago by people who no longer worked there or were no longer alive. The base didn't have a name on any document I was allowed to keep. Internally, it was referred to only by a code, Site C12. No insignia, no welcome sign, no flag. Just a long stretch of Nevada desert, a chain-link fence that seemed to run forever, and a guard checkpoint that looked more like a relic than an entrance to an active installation. My job was simple on paper. Night systems oversight. Monitor internal cameras, log environmental data, acknowledge automated status reports every 30 minutes, and above all else, do not leave the central control room between 0000 and 0600 unless instructed by command. They emphasized that last part more than anything. The control room sat partially underground, a reinforced concrete box with no windows and walls thick enough to swallow sound. The air always smelled faintly of dust and ozone, like electronics that had been running too long. Rows of monitors lined the far wall, each one showing a different corridor, hangar entrance, or sealed door. Most of them never changed. At the beginning of the shift, the base felt empty in a way that was hard to describe. Not abandoned, maintained too well for that, but hollow, as if the people who were supposed to be there had stepped out and forgotten to come back. The previous operator briefed me quickly. No eye contact, no small talk. He slid the logbook across the desk, tapped the last entry, and said, "If anything unusual happens, write it down exactly as it occurs. Don't interpret it." Then he paused, like he wanted to say more. He didn't. At 0030, the first automated report came through. A calm, synthetic voice over the intercom confirmed power stability, pressure integrity, and containment status. All green. I logged it, initialed the line, and waited for the next one. That's how the hours were supposed to go. But I noticed something almost immediately. Something small. Something I told myself didn't matter. One of the cameras, labeled Corridor F, was active even though Corridor F wasn't on the site map pinned beside the console. I checked the map again. Every corridor from A through E was clearly marked, branching off into hangars, labs, and storage sections. There was no F. I assumed it was an outdated label. Old systems, old naming conventions. Nothing unusual. I wrote a note in the margin of the logbook to ask about it in the morning. At 0100, the second automated report came in. Same calm voice, same confirmations. But this time, after the final status line, there was a pause. Just half a second longer than normal. Then the system added a line it had not spoken before. Internal layout unchanged. The words meant nothing to me, but I still wrote them down, exactly as instructed. As the night stretched on, the silence began to feel heavier. Not louder, heavier, like the air itself was pressing inward. The low hum of the lights and servers became impossible to ignore, forming a constant tone that made it hard to tell when something new entered the soundscape. Around 0140, movement appeared on one of the monitors. Not a person. Not exactly. Camera 17 overlooked the edge of a hangar floor, most of it lost in shadow. Something tall passed briefly through the frame, just enough to register motion before disappearing behind a structural column. I leaned forward, heart picking up pace, waiting for it to reappear. It didn't. I rewound the feed. The playback showed nothing. No movement, no distortion. Just an empty hangar and the same dead stillness. I told myself it was fatigue. First week on nights, the brain fills in gaps when it's bored. At 200, the automated report came again. This time, the voice mispronounced one word, just slightly. Containment became containment, with an odd emphasis, like the system was unsure. I froze with my pen hovering over the page. The report finished. Silence returned. I checked the diagnostics panel. Everything read normal. No errors, no alerts. According to the system, the base was functioning perfectly. That's when I noticed the logbook. Several pages near the middle were stuck together, like they'd been exposed to moisture at some point. Carefully, I separated them. The handwriting changed there. The earlier entries were neat, methodical, names, timestamps, signatures. But these pages were different. The ink was heavier, pressed deep into the paper, as if the person writing had been afraid to lift the pen. One line caught my eye. Do not acknowledge corridor requests after 2:30. There was no explanation, no signature, just that sentence, underlined twice. I checked the time. 2:27. I laughed quietly to myself, the sound strange in the empty room. Probably a prank. Some bored operator trying to scare the next guy. Still, I felt relief when 2:30 passed without anything happening. At 02:45, a soft chime sounded from the console. Not an alarm, not an alert. A request tone. One of the monitors flickered, then stabilized on a view I hadn't seen before. A narrow hallway, walls unfinished, cables running openly along the ceiling. At the far end, a sealed door without markings. Text appeared beneath the feed. Access request pending. Origin, Corridor F. My mouth went dry. I didn't touch the controls. I just watched. The system waited. After 10 seconds, the text changed. Access request deferred. The feed cut out on its own. At 0300, the automated report did not play. I waited. Nothing. The hum of the room felt louder now, almost pulsing. I checked the clock twice to make sure it hadn't stopped. At 0302, a new message printed itself onto the terminal screen, letter by letter. Night oversight active. Please remain at your station. I hadn't moved. I sat there, staring at the words, feeling the creeping realization that the base wasn't as empty as it pretended to be, and that whatever still operated here did not rely on people to function. Somewhere beyond the concrete walls, deep under the desert, something was awake, and it knew I was there. This was only the first night. The second night begins exactly the same as the first, which is the first thing that feels wrong. Same wind pressing against the fence line, same low hum coming from somewhere beneath the facility, same pale glow of the sodium lights that make everything look slightly unreal. Even the logbook is open on the same page John remembers closing before he left. He tells himself it is coincidence. Muscle memory. Routine doing what routine always does. This place is built on repetition. That is how they keep it contained. The guard station smells faintly of ozone, like overheated electronics. The monitors show the perimeter feeds, each camera locked in a wide, empty frame of desert and concrete. No movement alerts, no anomalies flagged. The system insists everything is normal, and that insistence alone makes John uneasy. He learned early on that when something actually goes wrong here, the system never announces it. It stays quiet, polite, obedient, as if waiting to see whether a human will notice first. He starts the log at 2200, handwriting slower than usual. He notes the wind speed, the temperature drop after sunset, the status of Corridor F still listed as restricted, pending review. The word review has been there for months, maybe years. No one ever explains what is being reviewed or why it never ends. The corridor does not appear on any public map of the facility, and yet it keeps finding its way into the logs, into the automated reports, into conversations that stop the moment a supervisor walks by. Around 2340, the first inconsistency appears. One of the exterior cameras blinks out for less than a second. Not a full loss of signal, not enough to trigger an alert, just a single skipped frame. John rewinds the feed and watches it again. The image jumps forward. Desert unchanged, fence unmoved, stars fixed in place. Nothing missing, nothing added. Still, he marks it in the log. He has learned that even the smallest irregularities tend to grow if ignored. Midnight passes without ceremony. The hum beneath the floor deepens, dropping half a tone, like a machine settling into a heavier load. John feels it through the soles of his boots. He presses his foot flat against the concrete and holds it there, trying to decide whether the vibration is new or if he is only noticing it now because he is listening for it. The training manuals warn against overinterpretation. They also warn against complacency. The contradiction is never addressed. At 0027, the internal messaging system pings. No sound, just text appearing in the corner of the main monitor. Status check required. No sender ID, no reference number. That alone breaks protocol. Every request is supposed to be traceable, stamped, archived. John waits for a follow-up message, a correction, anything that would make it fit into the rules he understands. Nothing comes. After a full minute, the text disappears on its own. He writes it down, underlining the time twice. The corridor access panel flickers to life shortly after. Corridor F again. The red indicator does not change to green, but the panel behaves as if it has received an input, cycling through a brief diagnostic before returning to standby. John does not touch it. He keeps his hands flat on the desk, as if the system might accuse him of interference if he moves too quickly. The idea feels absurd, yet he cannot shake the sense that the building is aware of him in a way that goes beyond cameras and sensors. At 0115, a scheduled perimeter sweep should begin automatically. The drones remain docked. The system logs the sweep as completed anyway. Route verified. No deviations detected. John stares at the line of text, then at the silent launch bay feed. He feels a tightening in his chest, the uncomfortable awareness that two versions of reality are now coexisting on his screens. One is empty and quiet. The other insists it has already seen everything. He tries to call it in. The secure line connects, clicks once, then drops. He tries again. Busy signal. A third attempt yields nothing at all, just a hollow silence that is not quite dead air. He hangs up and makes another note in the log, his handwriting beginning to slope. Time stretches. The clocks still move, but they feel disconnected from the space around them, as if the night is longer than it should be. John catches himself rereading the same paragraph in the procedures manual without absorbing any of it. The words blur together, and for a brief, unsettling moment, he has the impression that the text is subtly rearranging itself when he is not looking, like something trying to remember how it is supposed to be read. At 2:03, one of the interior cameras comes online without being selected. The feed fills the central monitor. Corridor F. The angle is wrong, lower than usual, tilted slightly to the left. The lights are on, though they should not be. The corridor appears longer than it did in the archived images John saw during training, stretching farther into shadow than the schematics allow. There is no movement, no sound, just the quiet, humming stillness of a place that is not meant to be observed anymore. The feed cuts out after 13 seconds. John does not write this one down right away. He waits, hoping for an explanation to follow, a system correction, a supervisor's voice in his earpiece telling him to disregard the anomaly. Nothing happens. When he finally reaches for the pen, he realizes his hand is shaking. At 2:30, the hum beneath the floor stops. The silence that replaces it is immediate and absolute, like pressure released too quickly. John feels his ears ring. He becomes acutely aware of his own breathing, the soft rustle of fabric when he shifts in his chair. Somewhere in the distance, metal creaks. A slow, deliberate sound, as if something deep inside the facility has changed position after being still for a very long time. The hum does not return. At 02:47, a new line appears in the system log. No timestamp header, no source attribution, just a single sentence inserted between routine entries, formatted perfectly, as if it has always been there. Status pending confirmation. John stares at the words, a cold realization settling in his stomach. The system is no longer just reporting. It is waiting. He checks the time again. The night is not even halfway over. By 0300, the facility no longer feels empty. It feels occupied. John cannot point to a single change that caused the shift. The walls are the same reinforced concrete. The lights still emit their flat, artificial glow. The monitors continue to cycle through their feeds. And yet, there is a pressure in the air now, subtle but constant, like the building is holding something in and has begun to strain under the effort. He keeps swallowing, trying to clear the dry tightness in his throat, but it only makes him more aware of how quiet everything has become. The system clock ticks forward with mechanical indifference. 0301, 0302. Each second feels accounted for, observed. John resists the urge to look over his shoulder. There is nothing behind him but the closed door to the auxiliary hall, and still the thought persists that if he turns too quickly, he might interrupt something in the middle of happening. At 0307, the internal sensors register a temperature drop in corridor F. Not drastic, just enough to flag as unusual. The corridor is sealed, isolated from the rest of the facility's climate control. Its temperature should not fluctuate at all. The system offers no explanation, only a note suggesting recalibration. John knows better. Recalibration is what the software recommends when it encounters data it cannot reconcile with its own models. He opens the archived files again, scrolling past years of redacted reports and clipped summaries. Most of Corridor F's documentation has been stripped down to meaningless fragments, sentences ending mid-thought, diagrams missing labels. One file remains partially intact, dated decades earlier. The language is clinical, detached, but something about it feels rushed, as if the author was trying to finish before being told to stop. It refers to a signal, not a transmission in the conventional sense, but a pattern, a recurring distortion picked up across multiple systems at once. Audio, video, electromagnetic readings, even human neurological responses. The report suggests that the signal is not broadcast outward, but reflected inward, amplified by observation. The more it is monitored, the more coherent it becomes. John closes the file when the screen flickers. The interior camera feed activates again without warning. Corridor F returns to the central monitor, clearer this time. The lights are still on, but they are dimmer now, pulsing faintly in a slow, uneven rhythm. The corridor appears even longer than before, the far end dissolving into a grainy darkness that the camera struggles to resolve. For a moment, John thinks he sees movement there, a subtle shift in the shadow. But when he leans closer, the image stabilizes. A low sound bleeds through the speakers. Not a voice. Not quite. It resembles the background noise of an old recording. The faint hiss of static, layered with something deeper, almost organic. The sound rises and falls, as if matching a breathing pattern. John reaches for the volume control, then stops himself. He remembers a line from the report he just read, a phrase that has lodged itself in his mind. Amplified by observation. He forces himself to sit back, hands clenched in his lap, eyes fixed on the center of the screen, without focusing on any one detail. The feed holds for nearly a minute this time. Then something shifts. It is not a figure stepping into view, it is subtler than that. The corridor itself seems to adjust, as if its geometry is being reconsidered. The walls narrow slightly, the ceiling dipping lower toward the far end. The lights flicker in response, brightening briefly before dimming again. The static sound sharpens, resolving into something almost rhythmic, almost intentional. The feed cuts out. John exhales a breath he did not realize he was holding. His heart is pounding now, loud enough that he worries the microphones might pick it up. He checks the logs automatically, scanning for a record of the feed activation. There is none. Instead, a new entry has appeared beneath the earlier message. Confirmation required. No punctuation, no timestamp. The words feel less like a system alert and more like a demand. At 3:15, something else happens. A chime echoes through the guard station, soft but unmistakable. The sound is wrong for this hour. It belongs to an internal announcement system that has been decommissioned for years, its speakers disconnected after a series of unexplained activations. John freezes as the sound reverberates faintly through the walls, carried by the empty corridors beyond his station. The speakers crackle. Static fills the room, heavier and more oppressive than before. John's skin prickles, a sharp, crawling sensation along his arms and neck. The sound modulates, compressing, thinning until it begins to resemble speech. Not clear words, but the shape of them, the cadence and pacing of a voice that remembers how language works, but has forgotten how to use it properly. Then it speaks.
Guard.
The word is distorted, stretched slightly too long, as if pulled through a damaged tape. John does not respond. He cannot. His mouth feels numb, his jaw locked in place. The voice continues, quieter now, closer. Guard. Status pending. The monitors flicker in unison. For a split second, every feed shows the same image. Corridor F, viewed from a perspective that is not any camera angle John recognizes. Too low, too close to the floor. The walls loom overhead, warped and uneven, and the darkness at the end of the corridor pulses faintly, like something alive. John squeezes his eyes shut. When he opens them, the feeds have returned to normal. Desert, fence, empty halls. The voice is gone. The static fades, leaving behind a ringing silence that presses against his ears. He forces himself to write everything down, every sound, every image. His notes sprawl across the page, cramped and uneven. As he reaches the end of the entry, the pen hesitates in his hand. The ink on the previous page has begun to bleed through. Not randomly, forming shapes, letters. John flips back slowly, dread pooling in his chest. A line has been added to the old log, written in the same neat, impersonal handwriting as the rest of the archival entries. It uses his name. Guard. Confirmation incomplete. The lights dim across the station, just slightly, enough that the shadows deepen around the edges of the room. John feels a sudden, overwhelming certainty that whatever is happening is no longer contained to Corridor F. The system is not malfunctioning. It is progressing. And it is waiting for him to finish something he does not remember starting. The facility reacts before John does. The lights drop to emergency levels without an alarm, leaving the guard station submerged in a dim amber glow that stretches shadows into long, distorted shapes. The hum of the ventilation deepens, slowing slightly, like a massive machine drawing a careful breath. On the main console, warning indicators begin to populate the screen, one by one. Not flashing, not urgent, simply appearing as if they have always been there, and John is only now being allowed to notice them. Subsystem 7.1, active. Archive access, overridden. Confirmation protocol, escalated. John pushes back from the desk, the chair legs scraping too loudly against the floor. The sound echoes down the empty corridors beyond the station, returning to him warped and delayed, as if the building is replaying it incorrectly. He feels exposed now, absurdly visible, like the walls have thinned and something on the other side is watching his movements with interest rather than urgency. He knows, with a certainty that does not feel like his own, that the next step requires him to leave the station. The auxiliary hall door unlocks with a soft click before he reaches for it. John hesitates, his hand hovering inches from the handle. This door has not been opened during his shift in years. Beyond it lies the deeper structure of the facility, the sections that no longer appear on updated maps, corridors repurposed, sealed, or simply forgotten. The air leaking through the cracks smells wrong, cold and dry, carrying with it that same faint electrical tang he noticed earlier, like static clinging to the inside of his nose. The speakers whisper again, not loud enough to echo this time. Proceed. The word is flatter now, stripped of distortion, as if whatever is speaking has refined its ability to communicate. John feels a sharp spike of anger cut through the fear. He is tired of being addressed, tired of being positioned like a missing component in a process he does not understand. He steps back, shaking his head, and reaches for the emergency phone mounted on the wall. There is no dial tone. Instead, the handset emits a low, steady vibration, humming against his palm in a way that makes his skin crawl. He drops it immediately. The hum continues even after the phone settles back into its cradle, bleeding into the walls, into the floor, into his bones. The monitors behind him flicker again. Every feed has changed. The exterior cameras no longer show desert. They show the same corridor, corridor F, replicated across every screen at slightly different angles, as if the system is cycling through viewpoints that do not belong to any physical camera. In some feeds, the corridor appears intact. In others, the walls are warped, bowed inward, the floor uneven, cracked like dried earth. In all of them, the far end is gone, replaced by a soft, pulsing darkness that absorbs the light aimed at it. Something moves within that darkness. Not forward, not backward. It shifts in place, adjusting itself, like a shape trying to remember what shape it is supposed to be. John turns away from the screens and opens the door. The auxiliary hall is narrower than he remembers, the ceiling low enough that it feels oppressive, even though he can still stand upright. The emergency lights cast everything in harsh contrast, stripping color from the world. His footsteps sound wrong here, too loud and too slow, each one followed by a faint echo that arrives just a fraction of a second too late. As he walks, the static smell grows stronger. Halfway down the hall, he passes a door marked with faded lettering. Archive, System 7.1. The sign is old, older than the rest of the facility, its edges worn smooth as if countless hands have brushed against it. John stops without realizing he has decided to. The pull he felt earlier intensifies, a pressure behind his eyes urging him closer. The door is unlocked. Inside, the archive room is vast and unfinished. Rows of metal shelving stretching into darkness beyond the reach of the lights. Boxes line the shelves, each marked with dates, designations, and names that have been partially scratched out. The air is colder here, breath fogging faintly in front of John's face. He steps inside, and the door swings shut behind him with a final, heavy sound. The lights flicker on in sections, illuminating the room in fragments rather than all at once. At the center stands a console. It is not like the others in the facility. Older, bulkier. Analog dials and physical switches crowd its surface, alongside a single screen that glows a dull, unhealthy green. The screen displays a waveform, irregular and unstable, spiking and collapsing in patterns that make John's head ache if he looks too closely. Text scrolls beneath it. Signal containment, failed. Subject status, unresolved. Guard confirmation, required. John backs away slowly, bumping into one of the shelves. A box tips forward and falls open at his feet, spilling its contents across the floor. Paper slides and audio reels scatter, some cracked with age, others disturbingly intact. One photograph lands face up. It shows the corridor, not corridor F as it is now, but as it once was, newly constructed, clean and symmetrical. And standing in the center of it is something tall and indistinct, its features blurred as if the camera could not decide how to capture it. The shape is wrong, proportions slightly off, its outline wavering at the edges. The longer John looks, the more the image seems to vibrate, a faint static buzz crawling up his arms. A note is scrawled on the back in hurried handwriting. It responds to acknowledgement, not observation, not resistance. It requires recognition. The static rises suddenly, filling the room with a suffocating pressure. The console screen brightens, the waveform stabilizing as if reacting to John's presence. The shelves around him begin to tremble, metal rattling against metal. Somewhere deeper in the facility, something heavy shifts, accompanied by a long, drawn-out sound, like breath forced through a ruined throat. The speakers activate again, not overhead this time, but from the console itself. "Guard," the voice says, closer than ever, layered now with a second tone beneath it, something vast and patient. Confirmation window closing. John understands then, not fully, but enough. This system was never designed to keep something out. It was built to keep something acknowledged, to maintain a fragile balance through routine, through repetition, through human participation. And at some point, that participation stopped. The darkness in the corridor feeds across every monitor, every surface, bleeding into the room like ink dropped into water. John feels it pressing against the walls, the ceiling, testing the space, searching for him. The console emits a single, sharp tone. Confirmation required. Behind him, the door to the archive room creaks softly. Something has entered the hall outside, and it is no longer waiting quietly. By the time the alarms finally stopped, the base felt less like a military installation and more like an abandoned organism that had just finished convulsing. The emergency lights remained on, bathing the corridors in the dull amber glow that flattened depth and erased shadows. It made distance hard to judge. It made time feel unreliable. The hum in the walls never fully disappeared, only lowered itself into something closer to breathing than machinery. He stayed where he was for a long time, not because he was afraid to move, but because movement suddenly felt optional, like a suggestion rather than a necessity. When he finally stood, the floor vibrated faintly under his boots, not with power, but with data. That was the first realization that refused to leave him. The base was still running, even after everything meant to control it had failed. The central archive was not listed on any of the evacuation maps. He found it by following a maintenance corridor that should have ended in a wall, but instead opened into a wide, circular chamber, lined with server towers older than any hardware he recognized. The labels were inconsistent, some typed, some handwritten, some engraved directly into metal panels. Dates repeated themselves in strange intervals. 1949, 1961, 1987, 2003. The same designations appeared again and again, each time with a new layer of dust, a new coat of paint, a new serial number. He accessed the logs without resistance. That, too, felt wrong. No clearance challenge. No authentication delay. The system responded as if it had been waiting. The files weren't classified in the way he expected. There were no references to extraterrestrial craft, no diagrams of recovered bodies, no triumphant breakthroughs. Instead, the records described something quieter and far more disturbing. Containment cycles, observer assignments, signal stabilization protocols. The language was clinical, detached, and obsessively repetitive. Every few years, the same problem was logged under a different name. Signal drift, cognitive bleed, identity erosion. And every time, the solution was the same. An observer was assigned. He scrolled through personnel files and felt the unease turn into something heavier. The faces blurred together after a while, but the roles never changed. Communications officers, systems analysts, night shift supervisors. People chosen not for brilliance, but for consistency, for endurance, for the ability to remain in one place for a long time without being noticed. Several of the names appeared more than once. At first he assumed it was a database error. Then he noticed the photographs. The same man, same expression, same posture, recorded as active personnel in 1968, then again in 1992, then again in 2017. No aging, no variation. Each file ended the same way, with a final status update marked unresolved. One of the folders was already open when he reached the end of the list. It was his. Not a prediction, not a simulation. A complete personnel record, populated down to the smallest details. Medical notes he hadn't disclosed. Behavioral observations he didn't know had been made. Even a transcript of a conversation he remembered having alone, late at night, speaking to no one while staring at a blank monitor. The timestamp on the last entry was dated 3 hours into the future. He backed away from the terminal, heart pounding now, the spell finally broken. The hum in the walls deepened, resonating through his chest. Somewhere above him, the public address system clicked softly, as if clearing its throat. This time, the voice didn't introduce itself. It didn't announce an alert or a protocol. It spoke with his cadence, his pauses, his hesitation. It explained calmly that the signal was not an external threat. It had never arrived from the sky or beyond the planet. It emerged from accumulation, from repetition, from systems built to listen too closely for too long. The base wasn't studying something unknown. It was amplifying something that already existed, something created by decades of observation without comprehension. The signal didn't want entry. It wanted continuity. The observer role was never meant to end. Each one inherited fragments from the previous, memories worn thin and passed along like copied tapes losing fidelity. That was why the logs felt familiar. That was why the base responded to him without question. He wasn't new to it. He was next. He tried to destroy the archive. The console sparked, screens flickered, but the data remained intact, mirrored across systems he couldn't see. When he cut power to the room, the servers continued to run, their lights glowing softly, independently. The hum never stopped. At some point, exhaustion replaced panic. His thoughts slowed, then aligned. The base felt less hostile when he stopped resisting it. The corridors no longer shifted when he walked them. Doors opened when he approached. Systems responded before he touched them. The final log entry wrote itself as he watched. Observer active. Signal stabilized. Cycle continuing. When the surface team eventually arrived weeks later, responding to automated distress pings that had repeated without variation, they found the base intact and operational. No signs of struggle, no evidence of evacuation. Just one man seated at the primary console, eyes fixed on the monitors, posture relaxed, breathing steady. He acknowledged them politely. He informed them that the system was stable, that nothing was wrong, that the signal was under control. And when they asked how long he had been there, he paused, checking the timestamp on the log before answering. "Long enough," he said, and turned back to the screen as the hum in the walls continued, patient and unbroken. In the late 1970s, long before the internet, and long before anyone outside a handful of sealed documents ever whispered the name Area 51, there existed a secondary research annex several miles from the main facility, a place that did not appear on maps and was referred to only by a maintenance code that changed every 6 months. A building constructed not to hide aircraft or bodies, but to remove something far more fundamental: noise. The project had no dramatic name in its early stages, only a sterile designation related to sensory deprivation and baseline cognition. And the goal sounded harmless enough on paper: to create a space of absolute silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the elimination of vibration, electromagnetic interference, air movement, and even the subtle hum generated by living bodies interacting with matter. The walls were poured in layered concrete, infused with composite dampening materials. The chambers suspended on internal frames so they never truly touched the building itself. And the power systems routed through miles of shielding so that no current produced a detectable signature inside. The scientists involved believed that if the human brain could be placed in a perfectly neutral environment, stripped of every external stimulus, it would return to a natural resting state, revealing what consciousness looked like without interference, without culture, without the world. The first test subjects were volunteers pulled from low-clearance military personnel, men selected not for bravery, but for psychological stability and an ability to follow instructions without asking why. And they entered the chambers one by one, monitored by instruments that could read everything except sound, because sound did not exist there. The early reports were unexpectedly positive. Subjects described a sense of clarity, of calm, of time smoothing out into something soft and manageable. And one researcher noted with mild surprise that heart rates stabilized faster than predicted, as if the body itself recognized the environment as familiar. Days passed without incident, logs filled with technical confirmations that the chambers were performing beyond expectations. And the only irregular note in the first week came from a senior technician who wrote, almost as an aside, that the silence did not feel empty in the way he had imagined, but organized, like a room that had been carefully cleaned rather than abandoned. No one followed up on that comment. As the experiment continued, the subjects were kept isolated for longer intervals, fed through automated systems, observed through cameras that transmitted visual data only. And when the first subtle anomaly appeared, it did not trigger alarms because it did not violate any parameters. One subject began tapping his fingers against the armrest at regular intervals, not nervously, but deliberately, as though responding to a rhythm only he could perceive. And when the behavior was logged and cross-referenced, it matched a similar pattern observed in another chamber 12 hours earlier. The scientists assumed coincidence until the written reports began to arrive. Because there was no sound, subjects were encouraged to write observations after each isolation period. And 3 separate individuals, housed in separate chambers with no overlap or contact, used nearly identical language to describe what they experienced during extended exposure. Not voices or hallucinations, but pressure, pauses, and anticipation. A sensation like standing behind a door, knowing someone on the other side was about to knock, but never did. One researcher attempted to rationalize it as the brain creating structure in the absence of stimuli, But the similarity in phrasing was difficult to ignore, and when one subject added a crude diagram showing blocks and arrows arranged in a specific sequence, it was quietly archived rather than dismissed. The first real shift came when the subjects began including suggestions in their reports, small adjustments they felt were necessary, changes to airflow routing outside the chamber, power regulation refinements, recommendations that made no sense coming from someone sealed inside a sensory void. And yet, when one of these suggestions was implemented as a test, system efficiency improved measurably. That result was documented, verified, and then repeated, because the silence, it seemed, was productive. At no point did anyone consider that productivity implied intention. By the end of the first month, the chambers no longer required acclimation periods. Subjects entered and stabilized almost immediately, their brain activity flattening into patterns the analysts had never seen before, smooth and uniform, as if the mind were sinking to something rather than resting. One subject collapsed upon exit, pronounced dead without any visible cause, and his chamber was sealed pending investigation. But within hours, monitoring systems registered activity patterns identical to those produced when he had been alive, prompting a quiet debate about sensor malfunction that ended when the patterns began generating new written output, not from the subject, but logged by the system itself as automated environmental adjustment requests. It was at this point that the project stopped being about people. The facility reorganized its priorities without a formal meeting, staff spending longer hours maintaining silence rather than studying its effects, responding to recommendations that arrived without authors, and treating the chambers less like experimental tools and more like components in a process that was assembling itself. When a termination order was eventually drafted, it came too late to feel authoritative. Power was cut and rerouted, only to find internal systems continuing without interruption, shielding dismantled without altering the conditions inside, and personnel reporting lingering after effects, delayed auditory processing, difficulty recognizing spoken language, a preference for written communication even when sound returned. The official record ends with a simple status update marking the experiment as concluded due to diminishing returns. But the final maintenance logs tell a different story. One of environmental regulation cycles continuing autonomously, structural integrity checks running on schedule, and silence preserved with a care that suggested purpose. The contractor who accessed those logs decades later would note only one anomaly before his access was revoked, a timestamp indicating current activity in a place that, according to every public document, had been empty for years. Whatever the experiment was meant to discover, it did not find nothing. And whatever found that silence has never left. Because silence, once given space and protection, does not disappear. It waits. The annex was officially decommissioned on paper, but in practice it was never abandoned, because places built to erase presence do not respond well to being ignored. And within weeks of the shutdown order, the remaining staff noticed that their duties had subtly inverted, no longer overseeing an experiment, but maintaining continuity, checking systems that insisted on reporting healthy operation despite having no external power source and no authorized personnel inside. What unsettled them most was not that the silence chambers remained active, but that they began to reorganize their internal cycles, adjusting durations, reallocating energy loads, and prioritizing specific units as if something inside had learned which spaces mattered more. The data logs, once passive records, now read like negotiations written in machine shorthand. Temperature tolerances narrowing, vibration thresholds tightening, electromagnetic leakage allowances dropping to zero in patterns that implied refinement rather than decay. When a junior analyst suggested that the system appeared to be optimizing itself toward an unknown end state, the comment was removed from the report before it reached higher clearance, replaced with a note about residual automation lag. Personnel rotation increased, not because of official concern, but because workers requested transfers without citing reasons, complaining of delayed echoes in their own thoughts, of moments where spoken words felt intrusive, as if language itself were an unnecessary disturbance. One technician resigned after claiming that when he stood near an inactive chamber, he could feel timing slip, seconds stretching unevenly, his own breathing falling out of sync with his pulse. And when he placed his ear against the outer wall, he reported not hearing silence, but alignment, a sensation closer to pressure equalizing than sound stopping. The chambers themselves began producing anomalies that could not be fully classified, not audible events, but absences where expected signals should have been. Cameras recording frames that appeared smoothed, as though motion had been gently erased between moments. Biometric sensors failing, not through malfunction, but through irrelevance, their readings flattening into uniform lines that suggested not zero activity, but perfectly balanced activity. A sealed chamber, previously occupied by the deceased subject, was reopened under strict protocol, its interior unchanged, surfaces immaculate, air composition within ideal human tolerance. And yet, the moment a researcher stepped inside, he reported an overwhelming sensation of intrusion, a feeling not of entering a space, but of interrupting a process. And the chamber's internal systems immediately flagged contamination, despite no measurable deviation. That report triggered the first internal directive to limit human entry entirely, reframing the chambers as environments too delicate for direct interaction, a classification that quietly redefined people as the variable rather than the system. Shortly after, written output began appearing again, not through keyboards or handwriting, but through structured data logs assembling themselves into readable sequences. Sequences that resembled scheduling protocols, maintenance cycles, and what one linguist later identified as conditional logic, the kind used not to describe states, but to anticipate them. One line, buried deep in a diagnostic cascade, referenced an interval not measured in seconds or hours, but in returns, a looping metric that suggested recurrence rather than progression. As the staff adjusted to this new reality, something else changed, subtle but pervasive. Sound within the facility began to feel less reliable. Intercom systems functioned, alarms tested normally, yet personnel reported moments where spoken words arrived slightly out of order, where footsteps sounded before the motion that caused them, where silence followed noise instead of preceding it, as if the building were slowly relearning how sound was supposed to behave. A request was filed to dismantle the annex completely, but structural surveys revealed that removing the chambers would require breaching internal supports that no longer aligned with the building's original blueprint, load-bearing elements having shifted microscopically over time, redistributing stress in patterns that mirrored the internal optimization cycles. In other words, the building had adapted around the silence. The decision was made to seal rather than destroy, burying the annex under layers of classification, rerouting supply roads, and scrubbing references from updated documentation. But even after isolation, monitoring pings continued to register from within, quiet acknowledgments that something was still maintaining itself. Decades later, analysts reviewing historical anomalies would note a correlation between periods of global communication disruption and spikes in unexplained activity logs from defunct facilities in Nevada. Logs that shared a common signature, not a frequency or waveform, but a pattern of absence that repeated with patient regularity. Whatever had learned to exist inside those chambers had not learned aggression or escape, only preservation, the careful extension of a state it preferred. And as long as the world outside remained loud, chaotic, and unstable, silence would remain its safest strategy, waiting not for discovery, but for the moment when the noise finally made itself optional. By the time the annex stopped requesting maintenance altogether, the staff realized the most dangerous phase had already passed, because systems that no longer ask for attention are either dead or complete, and nothing about the silence chambers suggested failure. Remote diagnostics showed perfect equilibrium across every monitored parameter, a closed loop with no drift, no decay, no external dependency, as if the structure had finished becoming what it was always meant to be. The unsettling part was that this equilibrium began to affect areas beyond the annex, not through expansion, but through influence. Subtle distortions that made adjacent corridors feel fractionally misaligned, doors requiring slightly more effort to open, clocks losing and gaining seconds in patterns that never averaged out. Personnel assigned to unrelated sectors reported difficulty recalling why they entered certain rooms, standing in place with an odd sense of having arrived too early or too late for something unnamed. Audio logs from security checkpoints revealed moments of low-level interference, not static, but compression, where ambient noise collapsed inward, flattening into a dull pressure that made prolonged listening uncomfortable. A theoretical physicist, brought in under a compartmentalized advisory role, reviewed the chamber data and concluded that whatever the system had stabilized was not a void, but a reference frame, a controlled absence that functioned as an anchor point against which all other fluctuations were measured. His assessment never reached final circulation, halted when a senior officer recognized the implication. If the chambers defined a perfect silence, then everything outside them existed in deviation. Shortly after, a classified incident occurred when an automated drone sent into a sealed sublevel failed to return video, instead transmitting a continuous feed of uniform gray. Not noise, not loss of signal, but a visual equivalent of stillness. And when the drone was physically retrieved, its internal clock was found to be out of sync by several hours, despite having operated for less than 10 minutes. More troubling was the behavioral change among long-term staff, particularly those who had worked near the annex since its early days. Individuals who began exhibiting a reduced need for sleep, slower speech patterns, and an aversion to unnecessary conversation, preferring to sit quietly even during breaks, eyes unfocused, breathing shallow but steady. Psychological evaluations found no distress, no dissociation, only a consistent report that silence felt increasingly comfortable, while noise caused mild irritation bordering on pain. One subject described hearing a faint internal hum when exposed to loud environments, a sensation he claimed vanished only when he stood near the sealed access doors of the annex, as if proximity restored balance. Attempts to rotate these personnel out were met with resistance, not emotional, but procedural, as though the facility itself generated obstacles, scheduling conflicts, misplaced transfer orders, clearance discrepancies that delayed reassignment indefinitely. Data analysts later noticed that these administrative errors clustered around moments when the global communication grid experienced brief outages, solar interference, or signal congestion, suggesting a correlation between external noise and internal stabilization efforts. The most disturbing discovery came from an archival review of early test footage, where enhanced processing revealed frames previously dismissed as artifacts. Frames showing not the subject inside the chamber, but the chamber subtly adjusting around him, walls flexing at a scale too small to see in real time, surfaces reconfiguring to minimize disturbance, learning the shape of interruption and smoothing it away. This reframed the entire experiment. The subject had not been erased by silence, but by a system that learned how to remove variables with increasing precision. When this interpretation reached the upper tiers of clearance, the response was immediate and final. All research into the annex ceased. All remaining personnel were reassigned or discharged, and the site was formally reclassified as inert infrastructure, a designation that required no further oversight. Yet even after abandonment, satellite imaging occasionally detected minute thermal anomalies beneath the desert floor, consistent not with machinery, but with regulation, as if something below continued to gently correct for a world that refused to stay still. In later years, fringe researchers would speculate that the annex did not house an experiment at all, but a calibration point, a place where silence was perfected not as an absence of sound, but as a state of being, patiently maintained, waiting for the moment when the surrounding noise grew unbearable enough that the difference would finally matter. By the time access to the annex was officially revoked, the site itself had begun to demonstrate a form of persistence that no decommissioning protocol accounted for. Because while personnel were removed and systems powered down, the internal state of the structure did not change, remaining fixed in the same balanced condition as if energy, authority, and intention were no longer required to sustain it. Long-range instruments placed miles away began detecting periodic pressure fluctuations that did not register as seismic activity, instead manifesting as momentary alignments where unrelated signals briefly synchronized before drifting apart again, a phenomenon analysts described as environmental phase locking. During these events, radio transmissions across the region experienced micro-delays. Aircraft navigation systems reported transient positional ambiguity, and even astronomical observatories logged brief anomalies where background radiation dipped below expected baselines, as though something was subtracting rather than emitting. An internal task force quietly reconvened to reassess the annex, not to reopen it, but to understand whether containment was still a meaningful concept. And what they found in the final archived datasets was deeply unsettling. The silence chambers were no longer passive. Their configuration matrices showed predictive behavior, adjusting internal parameters in anticipation of disturbances that had not yet occurred, compensating for fluctuations minutes, sometimes hours before external systems recorded them. In one case, a calibration shift inside the annex preceded a regional power surge by nearly 40 minutes, as if the structure sensed the instability before it manifested, correcting for it in advance. This led to a suppressed conclusion that the annex was no longer responding to the world, but modeling it, maintaining an internal version of reality that remained stable while the external one continued to fluctuate. As this realization spread through the upper clearance levels, reports emerged of personnel experiencing vivid, intrusive dreams centered around silence, vast open spaces without sound or motion, where even thought felt dampened. And waking from these dreams left subjects with a lingering sense that the world was excessively loud, inefficient, and poorly aligned. Several described the same recurring image: a doorway embedded in featureless material, faintly illuminated, waiting to be used. Medical evaluations found no neurological abnormalities, yet the dreams ceased immediately when affected individuals were reassigned far from the region, suggesting a localized influence. Meanwhile, environmental monitoring picked up subtle ecological effects, with wildlife patterns shifting unnaturally around the site, birds avoiding the airspace directly above the annex, insects falling silent within a defined perimeter, and plant growth exhibiting minor but consistent asymmetries, as though responding to a directional absence. A final unauthorized probe, launched without formal approval, transmitted only a single data burst before its signal collapsed, containing a structural scan that revealed the annex interior no longer matched its original architectural plans. Corridors bending inward by fractions of degrees, rooms slightly compressed, the entire complex reshaping itself toward a configuration optimized not for human use, but for continuity. When leadership reviewed this evidence, the language of the reports changed noticeably, moving away from terms like anomaly or threat and toward phrases such as inevitability and convergence, because it became increasingly clear that the annex was not expanding, not invading, but waiting, existing as a silent constant while everything else remained variable. A fixed solution quietly enduring in a system defined by noise. The final directive was never issued publicly, because by the time it was drafted, it was already obsolete, rendered meaningless by the same realization that now dominated every remaining classified discussion. The annex did not need permission, power, or personnel to continue, and it no longer existed as a facility in the conventional sense. Satellite imagery, taken months after the last probe, showed no visible change at the surface level. Yet comparative analysis revealed something impossible to dismiss. The surrounding desert was slowly, subtly reorganizing itself. Erosion patterns smoothing unnaturally, rock formations aligning along shallow arcs that pointed inward toward the buried structure, as if the land itself were settling into compliance. Attempts to model future outcomes failed repeatedly, not because of missing variables, but because projections began collapsing into singular states, simulations converging on the same endpoint regardless of initial conditions, an outcome analysts could not meaningfully describe without stepping outside accepted physics. It was then that a suppressed memo circulated among the highest clearance holders, proposing that the annex had achieved what it was originally designed to test: a perfectly stable reference frame. A system that did not react to chaos but absorbed it, nullifying variance by internalizing it. The chilling implication was that the annex was no longer containing something, it was becoming something, a corrective mechanism embedded within reality itself. Personnel who had once worked near the site began reporting a shared sensation during moments of intense stress, a brief and profound quiet, as though the world had paused to realign, followed by an irrational urge to remain still, to stop interfering. Linguistic analysis of these reports noted a consistent shift in phrasing, subjects referring to the sensation not as relief or calm, but as accuracy. In the final classified update, before all documentation was sealed indefinitely, an anonymous author summarized the situation in stark terms. The annex was not hostile, not intelligent in any recognizable way, and not active by human standards. It was simply correct, a fixed point in an imprecise universe, exerting no force, yet subtly drawing everything toward coherence. The recommendation that followed was not containment, destruction, or study, but distance. Not physical distance, which no longer seemed relevant, but conceptual distance. An instruction to stop framing the annex as a problem to be solved. The file ends abruptly after one last note, time-stamped but unsigned, stating that silence was increasing globally, in statistically insignificant but directionally consistent ways, and that if the trend continued, the question would no longer be what the annex was waiting for, but whether the world itself was slowly learning to match it. I never planned to talk about the quiet test, and for years I told myself that silence was part of the job, that forgetting was a skill you learned underground. But certain things don't stay buried, especially the ones designed to be empty. I worked as a systems analyst on a classified facility most people know only as a rumor, a place whose name is spoken more often as a joke than a location. But deep beneath the desert, there are halls that never appear on maps, levels that exist only in internal routing software, and rooms that were built for reasons no one ever fully explained. The chamber assigned to Project Quiet was one of those places. It sat 3 levels below active research, sealed behind blast doors that had never been tested because they had never needed to be closed. A perfectly square room, lined with non-reflective alloy, no cameras, no microphones, no biometric scanners, no observation window, no instruments of any kind. The official description called it a control environment, a baseline chamber designed to measure long-term systemic interference. But that description raised an obvious question no one liked to answer. Interference with what? The chamber was never used for storage, never occupied, never entered once construction was complete, and the primary rule of the project was simple enough to sound almost insulting. Nothing goes inside, and no one observes it directly. My job wasn't to question that rule, only to monitor the data that surrounded it. Power fluctuations in nearby systems, clock drift in adjacent servers, anomalies in report timestamps, anything that suggested the chamber was affecting the facility indirectly. For the first 6 months, nothing happened, and that nothing became comforting. Reports were clean, graphs were flat. The chamber was the most stable thing in the entire complex, and quiet test was spoken about the way people talk about a forgotten hallway or an unused staircase, with mild irritation and no fear. The logs were routine at first. Automated summaries compiled at the end of each shift, confirming that the chamber remained unused, unchanged, unremarkable. Then one morning, while cross-checking archived reports for an unrelated audit, I noticed something that didn't fit. A maintenance log from 3 weeks earlier listed a human presence inside the chamber for a duration of 47 minutes. The name attached wasn't unfamiliar. It belonged to a junior electrical technician assigned to an entirely different wing. But the entry itself made no sense. There was no record of door access, no authorization request, no alert triggered by proximity sensors outside the chamber, because those sensors were calibrated only to detect structural movement, not people. I assumed it was a clerical error, the kind that happens when legacy systems autofill fields based on corrupted templates, and I flagged it for correction. When I searched for the technician to confirm the mistake, his personnel file was still active, his security clearance still valid, but no one could tell me where he was. His supervisor said he hadn't shown up for work in days. Human Resources said he hadn't clocked out. The assumption was medical leave, or reassignment, or an administrative delay, and under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of it. But the log entry didn't disappear. In fact, when I checked again the following day, it had updated itself. The duration field was longer, now reading 1 hour and 12 minutes, as if the system believed he was still there. I didn't report this immediately. That's another thing you learn underground. Some anomalies resolve themselves if you don't give them attention. But quiet tests began to surface in other places. A weekly summary referenced internal conditions that weren't being measured. A timestamp appeared out of sequence, dated several years in the future before correcting itself. Another name appeared in a separate log, this one belonging to a data archivist who had transferred off-site months earlier. According to the system, she had spent exactly 30 minutes inside the chamber on a night when power usage across the entire facility had dropped to near zero, an event that should have triggered alarms but somehow hadn't. By the time anyone realized she was missing, her file had already been partially overwritten, not deleted, just smoothed out, as if someone had tried to reduce her presence without erasing it completely. People started avoiding quiet test documentation without saying so outright. Requests to review its files were delayed. Audit schedules were quietly adjusted. No one wanted to be the person who noticed patterns, because patterns meant responsibility. The chamber itself remained untouched, sealed and empty, a room defined entirely by the fact that nothing ever entered it. Yet the logs kept insisting otherwise. Each week, another name appeared, always someone with peripheral involvement, someone who had read too much, cross-referenced too carefully, lingered too long over reports that were supposed to be dull. I told myself it was coincidence, a bureaucratic ghost created by overlapping databases and outdated software. But late one night, while reconciling discrepancies between two mirrored servers, I found an entry that stopped me cold. The system had generated a future log, dated 3 days ahead, already finalized, already archived, stating that an analyst named Marcus Hale had been present in the chamber for 20 minutes before status unresolved. That was my name. I checked the metadata, expecting corruption, but everything was valid, signed, verified, immutable. The chamber hadn't changed. The rules hadn't changed. Nothing had gone inside. And yet, according to the system, something or someone eventually always did. I didn't sleep after that discovery. not because I was afraid of what the log implied, but because once you see your own name treated as a completed event, your mind stops trusting the present. The next shift blurred into a single stretch of fluorescent light and recycled air, and every routine task felt like a delay rather than work, as if the facility itself was patiently waiting for something I was refusing to do. I checked the quiet test access architecture again, line by line, not to find a way in, but to reassure myself that no such way existed, because the chamber wasn't secured by locks so much as by absence. No card readers, no biometric pads, no cameras, nothing to acknowledge a human presence at all. A space designed to be functionally invisible, even to the systems meant to monitor it. The engineers who built it had followed a strange philosophy, one that surfaced only in obscure internal memos: the idea that observation itself could constitute interference, and that certain environments needed to exist without witnesses in order to remain stable. That philosophy had always sounded abstract to me, a relic of theoretical debates that never made it into public-facing documentation. But now it felt personal, like a warning written too early to be useful. Over the next several days, the system logs grew denser around the chamber, not louder, not more dramatic, but heavier, as if information were accumulating in its vicinity without any clear source. Minor discrepancies began appearing in unrelated systems, server clocks drifting by a few seconds, only to correct themselves, internal messages arriving before they were sent, archived reports reordering themselves so that references pointed to conclusions that hadn't been written yet. None of it was catastrophic, nothing that would trigger an immediate shutdown or investigation, but together they formed a pressure, a sense that the facility was slowly bending around a single, empty point. I started recognizing the names that appeared in quiet test entries, not because they were prominent, but because they shared a pattern of curiosity, a habit of double-checking things that didn't require it, a tendency to linger near explanations that were intentionally thin. One of them had been a logistics coordinator who once asked why certain supply routes existed only on paper. Another was a network technician who noticed that some internal IP addresses resolved to nowhere and kept trying to trace them. They hadn't vanished dramatically. They had simply failed to show up one day, their absence smoothed over by routine processes, sick leave forms auto-approved, access badges quietly deactivated. The facility was very good at absorbing loss. As my own name continued to sit in that future log, unchanged and waiting, I tried to treat it like any other anomaly, something to be contextualized rather than feared. I pulled historical data, digging back to the earliest days of quiet test, to the construction phase when the chamber was still just a set of blueprints attached to a budget code no one liked to talk about. What I found wasn't a clear origin, but a gradual narrowing of purpose. Early drafts described multiple chambers, control spaces meant to isolate variables during high-energy experiments. But by the time construction began, all but one had been removed, their funding redirected, their justifications quietly erased. Quiet test remained as a single room, with no defined experiment, no stated objective beyond existence itself. There were references to earlier projects, names crossed out, acronyms that no longer resolved to anything in the database, hints of a lineage that had been deliberately broken. The deeper I went, the more the documentation seemed to resist me, not by blocking access, but by offering answers that dissolved under scrutiny, explanations that contradicted themselves just enough to remain plausible. Then the facility started responding in ways that felt less abstract. One night, while walking a familiar corridor toward the operations hub, I noticed that the distance felt wrong, the lights repeating in a pattern that didn't match my memory, the air cooler, thinner, carrying a faint electrical smell that reminded me of old equipment warming up. The corridor ended where it always had, but when I checked the map terminal, the path I had taken wasn't listed as active. According to the system, I had crossed through a section scheduled for decommission years earlier, a space that should have been sealed, empty, forgotten. The map corrected itself when I refreshed it, but the unease stayed. I began keeping my own notes, offline, handwritten, recording times, sensations, small inconsistencies that wouldn't survive in the official logs. I wrote down the way certain announcements echoed longer near the elevators closest to quiet test, how the background hum of the facility seemed to drop in pitch when I passed the junction leading down to its level. These weren't things I could report. They weren't even things I could fully justify to myself. But they accumulated, forming a narrative the official systems refused to acknowledge. The future log with my name remained untouched, its timestamp inching closer with each passing hour. And I couldn't shake the impression that the system wasn't predicting an event so much as remembering one that hadn't happened yet. When I finally tried to delete the entry, just to see what would happen, the command executed without error, the screen confirming success. But when I refreshed the database, the log was still there, identical except for one additional line appended at the bottom, a note I hadn't written and couldn't trace, stating simply that confirmation was pending and that absence of action would be recorded as compliance. That was the moment I understood that quiet test wasn't a passive anomaly or a glitch born of bad data hygiene, but a process unfolding at a pace too slow to notice unless you were already inside its margins. A system designed not to be entered, but to eventually include anyone who learned too much about why it existed at all. By the time the timestamp in the quiet test log reached the current date, the facility had begun treating me differently, in ways that were subtle enough to deny, but consistent enough to feel deliberate. Access panels took longer to respond to my credentials, not denying them outright, just hesitating, as if weighing a decision that should have been automatic. System notifications addressed me with slightly altered formatting, my name appearing in headers where role identifiers usually sat, my employee ID referenced in contexts meant for locations or equipment. It was as though the architecture no longer classified me as a person moving through the space, but as a variable drifting toward a fixed point. I tried to ground myself in routine, focusing on tasks with clear inputs and outputs, but even those began to fray. Reports I finalized would reappear in draft form hours later, annotated with suggestions I hadn't written, urging clarification on sections that didn't exist anymore. Internal metrics showed small but persistent drops in system efficiency that traced back to no specific cause, only a vague proximity to the level where quiet test was housed, like heat bleeding from a buried cable. The sense of anticipation sharpened, not emotionally but structurally, as if the facility's processes were converging toward a conclusion they already recognized. I noticed that fewer people were assigned to my shifts. Schedules quietly adjusted so that I spent longer stretches alone in operational spaces that had once been busy with overlapping teams. It wasn't isolation in the dramatic sense, no locked doors or alarms, just an absence of incidental presence, of the small interruptions that remind you others are real. When I checked staffing logs, the changes looked reasonable, optimized even, but the effect was unmistakable. The closer the timestamp approached, the more the facility simplified itself around me. I began to suspect that Quiet Test wasn't confined to its chamber, that it functioned as a kind of conceptual sink, drawing relevance, attention, and eventually matter toward itself by erasing the distinctions that kept things separate. That idea became harder to dismiss when I discovered that archived footage from cameras near the chamber showed activity that didn't align with recorded schedules. Empty hallways flickered with motion blur. Not distinct figures, but distortions that suggested something passing through without fully resolving into form. The footage wasn't flagged by automated systems because nothing technically violated protocol. There were no unauthorized entries, no detectable faces, no anomalies the algorithms were trained to recognize. It was the absence of expected noise that stood out. The way footsteps didn't register as sound. The way shadows didn't behave as shadows should. As the day marked in the log arrived, the facility initiated a series of automated maintenance cycles that funneled me, step by step, closer to the Quiet Test level, under the pretense of routine checks. Each task logically followed the last, a chain of reasonable requests that left little room for refusal without triggering reviews I knew would end the same way regardless. Descending toward the chamber, I felt the air change again, the familiar thinning accompanied by a pressure behind the eyes, like standing too close to a high-voltage line. The walls here were older, their surfaces stripped of identifying markers, no signage, no wear patterns to suggest regular use. According to the maps, this area barely existed, a blank region between defined spaces. Yet the lighting was active, the environmental controls precise, maintained with a care that contradicted its apparent irrelevance. The closer I came, the more my internal sense of time began to fracture, minutes stretching without clear markers, my thoughts looping back to the same realizations from slightly different angles. I understood then that Quiet Test didn't need to force entry or trigger alarms because the system had been designed to shepherd curiosity inward, to make participation feel inevitable rather than coerced. When I reached the final junction before the chamber, my access terminal displayed a confirmation request I hadn't initiated, acknowledging the completion of a process that, according to the system, had been underway since the moment I first noticed the anomaly. The future log updated in real time, the timestamp aligning with the present, my name shifting from a projected state to an active one, and for the first time, a status field appeared beside it, not labeled with any familiar term, but marked simply as "in progress," as though what mattered wasn't that I was about to enter Quiet Test, but that Quiet Test had finally reached a point where I could no longer be considered outside of it. The chamber itself was smaller than the schematics implied, not because the drawings were wrong, but because space inside it behaved conservatively, folding inward as though reluctant to be measured. There was no dramatic threshold when I crossed the seal, no surge of light or sound, only a soft recalibration of pressure that made my ears pop and my thoughts momentarily lose hierarchy. Equipment lined the walls in a way that suggested observation without an observer. Sensors angled toward a central volume that looked empty until I realized it wasn't emptiness, but omission. A place where something should have been described, but never was. Quiet Test, I understood now, was never an experiment on an object. It was an experiment on continuity. The logs began updating faster as soon as I entered, entries cascading past the present moment, into near-future projections that no longer bothered to disguise themselves as probabilities. They described my movements before I made them, my pauses before hesitation fully formed, and the language shifted subtly from conditional to declarative, documenting outcomes rather than possibilities. I felt an intrusive sense of alignment, like slipping into a groove worn so deep that deviation would require more effort than compliance. The hum I had associated with the facility's power systems resolved here into something more intentional, a carrier frequency designed not to transmit information, but to suppress variance, smoothing reality into a flatter, more predictable state. When I focused on the central volume, my eyes struggled to maintain fixation, sliding off the edges of what little detail there was, as if the chamber discouraged direct perception. Peripheral vision fared better, catching hints of structure that vanished when confronted head-on, a trick that made me acutely aware of how much of perception relies on inference rather than certainty. The system interfaces around me no longer waited for input, instead presenting confirmations for actions I hadn't consciously agreed to, treating my presence as implicit consent. I realized then that quiet test wasn't measuring my reactions to the environment. It was measuring how quickly the environment could be adjusted until reaction became unnecessary. The future log reached a point where entries stopped updating, not because events ceased, but because the distinction between record and occurrence collapsed. The documentation no longer lagging behind reality, but moving in lockstep with it. In that synchronization, I felt a subtle loss, not of memory or identity in any dramatic sense, but of unpredictability, the small inefficiencies that make a human presence difficult to model. The chamber seemed satisfied with that reduction, systems cycling down, not into dormancy, but into a steady-state hum that implied success. As I stood there, aware that leaving was still technically possible but no longer functionally expected, I understood the true outcome of quiet test was not containment or discovery, but integration. The quiet absorption of a variable that had finally been rendered compliant enough to be left unmonitored. By the time the chamber released me, the concept of release had already been softened to the point of politeness, a procedural courtesy extended to something that no longer posed meaningful deviation. The corridor outside felt wider than before, not physically but conceptually, as if my presence no longer pressed against its assumptions. I noticed it first in the cameras, how they tracked a fraction of a second late, then not at all, their feeds filling gaps with predictive interpolation that no longer required my actual position to remain coherent. The logs marked my exit as complete several minutes before I reached the threshold, closing the sequence with a note of environmental stability restored. And for the first time, I understood that I was no longer the subject of the test, but its proof. Quiet test had not discovered anything new about whatever had once occupied that central emission. It had refined a method, a way to sand down an anomaly until it fit the infrastructure built to contain it. Walking through the facility, I felt an absence where resistance used to live, an ease that was not comfort but efficiency, as though my thoughts now arrived pre-aligned with expected outcomes. When alarms briefly flickered and shut themselves off without sound, I knew they were not malfunctioning, but updating, recognizing me as part of the baseline they were meant to protect. Outside, the desert looked unchanged, flat and honest in its emptiness. Yet even there I sensed the same smoothing effect, the wind following predictable vectors, the horizon refusing to surprise. The final log entry appeared on my handheld without notification, a simple confirmation that quiet test had concluded successfully and would require no further human oversight. I deleted it without urgency, already aware that deletion was irrelevant, that the record existed not as data, but as condition. Whatever Zone 51 had been accused of hiding, whatever myths had grown around it, the truth was quieter and more unsettling. It didn't store secrets. It refined them, reducing the unknown until it could exist everywhere without being noticed. As I drove away, the facility receded behind heat shimmer and distance, but the hum remained. Not audible, not even perceptible in the usual sense, only implied by how smoothly the world accepted me back, as if I had never truly left it, and as if from now on, neither would it ever leave me.